John Anderson had always been the kind of guy who liked things simple. After decades of climbing the corporate ladder, working long hours in a suit and tie, he finally decided it was time to hang up his briefcase for good. Retirement wasn't just about slowing down, it was about starting fresh. And so, with his savings tucked away and dreams bigger than ever, John bought himself a piece of paradise. A sprawling ranch nestled on the edge of town. The ranch was everything John could have hoped for. Rolling green hills stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with wildflowers that swayed gently in the breeze. There were pastures where cattle grazed lazily, old oak trees that stood tall like silent sentinels, and best of all, a crystal-clear lake right smack in the middle of the property. It wasn't just any lake, it was his lake. Stocked full of bass and trout, it promised countless afternoons of quiet fishing, surrounded by nothing but nature's symphony. For John, this place wasn't just land. It was freedom, but life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. While John's ranch was secluded and peaceful, it wasn't exactly isolated. On one side of his property, there was a fence, a tall wooden barrier separating his land from an upscale gated community. This neighborhood wasn't your average suburb. It was filled with manicured lawns, fancy cars parked in driveways, and homeowners who took pride in their picture-perfect lives. The kind of place where people held annual block parties and complained if someone's mailbox didn't match the aesthetic. The community was governed by a homeowners association, HOA, which, like most HOAs, had rules stricter than a school principal's dress code. Everything from the color of your front door to how loud you could play music at night fell under their watchful eye. Over the years, John had heard whispers about how controlling they could be, but he never paid much attention. His property was separate, clearly marked, and legally his. What did he care what the neighbors thought? For the most part, things stayed peaceful between John and the HOA. Sure, there were occasional hiccups like when one of his cows wandered too close to the fence line or when the sound of his tractor early in the morning ruffled a few feathers, but nothing major. Neighbors would occasionally wave hello during morning walks, and John figured that was enough. He kept to himself, minded his own business, and enjoyed the serenity of his new home. One sunny afternoon, John decided it was time to break in his fishing rod. He packed a small cooler with ice-cold lemonade, grabbed his tackle box, and headed down to the lake. As he walked along the shoreline, the sun warm on his back, he couldn't help but smile. This was living the kind of moment he dreamed about for years. He cast his line into the water, watching as the ripples spread outward, distorting the reflection of the blue sky above. Hours passed in blissful silence. Birds chirped in the distance, dragonflies darted across the surface of the water, and every now and then, John felt a tug on his line that hinted at dinner possibilities. But unbeknownst to him, trouble was brewing just beyond the fence. Someone from the neighboring HOA community had spotted him fishing and immediately jumped to conclusions. To them, John looked suspicious, a stranger standing near their lake, doing something that surely required permission. Without hesitation, they picked up the phone and dialed 911. When the call came in, dispatchers listened as the caller explained their concerns. They described John as a potential trespasser, someone who might be encroaching on community property. Whether it was out of genuine confusion or misplaced vigilance, the message got through loud and clear: send help. Within the hour, 2 police officers arrived at the scene. Their patrol car kicked up dust as it rolled down the dirt path leading to the lake. John looked up from his fishing spot, startled by the sudden intrusion. At first, he thought maybe someone nearby needed assistance. But when the officers stepped out of the car, their expression serious, he realized this was about him. "Sir," one of the officers began, approaching cautiously, "We received a report that you might be trespassing here. Is this your property?" John blinked, caught off guard. "Trespassing? No. This is my land," he said quickly, gesturing toward the lake. "I own this entire ranch, including the lake. I've got papers to prove it." He rummaged through his bag and pulled out a copy of the deed, pointing to the section that outlined the boundaries of his property. The officers studied the document carefully, nodding as they pieced together the facts. After a few minutes, they concluded that John was telling the truth. With apologies for the misunderstanding, they left the scene, leaving John alone once again. But while the cops may have gone, the damage was already done. Word traveled fast in the gated community, faster than wildfire on a dry summer day. By the time the sun set that evening, everyone seemed to know about the mysterious man fishing by the lake. Some whispered that he was trouble. Others speculated that he was deliberately trying to provoke them. And though John had no idea what was being said behind closed doors, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, as he sat on his porch sipping coffee, John stared out at the dark outline of the lake. Something told him this was only the beginning of a much bigger story. The next morning, John woke up expecting the calm routine he'd grown accustomed to since moving to the ranch. He brewed himself a strong cup of coffee, fed the chickens, and took a moment to breathe in the crisp air while leaning against the porch railing. But as he glanced toward the fence line, something felt different. There was an unease lingering in the atmosphere. Like the quiet before a storm. It didn't take long for that feeling to turn into reality. By mid-afternoon, a letter arrived in his mailbox, a formal-looking envelope with the HOAS logo stamped neatly on the front. Curious but wary, John opened it and began reading. The tone was polite enough, but the message hit him like a punch to the gut. The HOA demanded that he immediately stop using the lake until further notice. Their reasoning? They claimed the body of water fell under a vague clause in their covenants about shared natural resources. John blinked at the words, rereading them twice to make sure he wasn't misunderstanding. Shared natural resources? This was his lake literally written into the deed of his property. How could they possibly think they had any claim over it? Frustrated but determined not to let this slide, John called his attorney, someone he'd worked with during the purchase of the ranch. After explaining the situation, his lawyer assured him the HOAS claims were baseless. "They're barking up the wrong tree," his lawyer said confidently. "But if they push back, we'll need to be ready to fight." For a few days, things seemed quiet again. John went about his daily life, trying to focus on the peace and beauty of his ranch. But then the harassment started, and it came in waves. Late at night, loud music blared from the other side of the fence, shattering the silence that John cherished so much. Spotlights appeared, shining directly onto his property, making it impossible to sleep without pulling the curtains tight. It wasn't just noise either. Some mornings he'd find trash tossed near the fence or tire tracks tearing up the edge of his pasture. The worst part? The constant stream of complaints filed with local authorities. Neighbors from the gated community kept calling the police, reporting everything from supposed illegal dumping to alleged hunting activity on John's land. Every time officers showed up, John had to explain himself all over again, showing documents and pointing out boundary markers. While none of these accusations held water, the repeated visits wore him down. Each knock on his door felt like another brick being added to a wall separating him from the peaceful retirement he'd dreamed of. What made it even more infuriating was the hypocrisy. These same neighbors who complained about noise would throw parties late into the night, their laughter echoing across the fields. They accused him of damaging shared resources, yet John hadn't touched anything outside his own property lines. He prided himself on taking care of the land. He trimmed trees, cleaned debris from the lake, and maintained fences better than most people did inside city limits. Yet here he was, painted as the villain. Word spread quickly within the gated community, too. Some residents whispered behind closed doors, convinced John was trying to stir up trouble. Others openly criticized him, saying things like, "He should have known what kind of neighborhood this is before buying next door." One particularly bold neighbor even marched up to the fence one afternoon, glaring at John as he worked in the yard. "You can't just do whatever you want out here," the man snapped, crossing his arms. "This isn't your personal playground." John stopped what he was doing and turned to face him. "Actually," he replied calmly, though his jaw tightened, "it is my personal playground. I paid for this land fair and square. If anyone's overstepping, it's y'all." The neighbor scoffed and stormed off, muttering under his breath. But John knew this confrontation wouldn't be the last. Tensions were rising, and the once dormant feud between him and the HOA was turning into a full-blown battle as weeks passed. The stress began to weigh heavily on John. Sleep became elusive, thanks to the spotlights and late-night noise. His mind raced with questions. Why couldn't they leave him alone? What gave them the right to dictate how he used his own property? And why did it feel like no matter how many times he proved his case, they refused to listen? One evening, sitting by the fire pit with a cup of tea, John stared out at the dark outline of the lake. The place that once brought him joy now felt tainted. He thought about selling the ranch, starting fresh somewhere else where no one could interfere, but deep down, he knew running wouldn't solve anything. Selling would mean letting them win, and John wasn't the type to back down from a fight not when he was in the right. Instead, he decided to dig deeper. With his lawyer's guidance, he gathered every piece of evidence he could find. Satellite images showing the clear boundaries of his property, historical records proving ownership of the lake, and expert opinions from surveyors confirming there was no legal basis for the HOA's claims. Armed with this information, John prepared to strike back not out of anger, but out of principle. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, John realized something important. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up against injustice, about setting an example for others who might find themselves in similar situations. If he backed down now, it wouldn't just hurt him, it would embolden the OA to bully someone else in the future. No, John thought firmly. He had to see this through, no matter how messy it got. Little did he know, the road ahead would test his patience, his resolve, and even his faith in humanity. But one thing was certain: John Anderson wasn't going down without a fight. John had always been a reasonable man. He wasn't the type to pick fights or stir up drama, but this situation was different. The HOA wasn't just making baseless claims, they were actively trying to disrupt his life. Every night of sleep lost, every rude confrontation at the fence line, and every unnecessary visit from the police felt like another weight added to his shoulders. Enough was enough. It was time to fight back. Sitting in his lawyer's office one afternoon, John laid out everything that had happened over the past few weeks. He explained the harassment, the false accusations, and the growing hostility from the gated community. His lawyer listened carefully, jotting notes on a legal pad before finally leaning back in his chair. "You've got a strong case here," he said with a confident nod. "But if we're going to do this, we need to go all in." All in meant filing a lawsuit, not just for compensation, but to send a message. Together, they drafted a complaint accusing the HOA of harassment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. At the heart of the lawsuit was a staggering claim: $2.5 million in damages. To some, it might have sounded excessive, but John knew exactly what he was asking for. This wasn't about greed. It was about holding them accountable for the chaos they'd caused. The $1.8 million represented compensatory damages money to cover the tangible losses John had suffered. Sleepless nights had left him exhausted, affecting both his mental health and ability to enjoy retirement. Legal fees were piling up, not to mention the cost of repairing property damage caused by spotlights and trespassing. Then there was the hit to his reputation. Neighbors who didn't know him personally now viewed him as trouble, spreading rumors and painting him as the bad guy. The remaining $700,000? That was punitive damages, a way to punish the HOA for their reckless behavior and deter similar actions in the future. John wanted to make sure no one else would have to endure what he was going through. As his lawyer put it, sometimes you have to hit them where it hurts in the wallet. When the lawsuit was officially filed, it sent shockwaves through the gated community. News traveled fast, and soon everyone was talking about it. Some residents were outraged, convinced John was being unreasonable. Others whispered quietly among themselves, wondering if maybe the HOA had gone too far this time. A few even admitted to feeling guilty about their role in escalating the conflict, though none were brave enough to say it publicly. For the HOA board, panic set in almost immediately. They scrambled to hire a team of high-powered attorneys to defend against the lawsuit. Meetings were called, emails flew back and forth, and emergency sessions became the norm. Behind closed doors, tempers flared as members argued over how to handle the situation. Some insisted they were in the right and should fight tooth and nail. Others suggested settling quickly to avoid further embarrassment or worse, financial ruin. Meanwhile, John tried to keep living his life as normally as possible, but it wasn't easy. The tension between him and the HOA had reached a boiling point, spilling over into everyday interactions. When he drove into town for groceries, he noticed people staring or whispering behind his back. One neighbor refused to acknowledge him when they passed each other in the hardware store aisle. Even the local postmaster seemed hesitant to make small talk, glancing nervously whenever the topic of the ranch came up. Despite the mounting pressure, John remained steadfast. He spent hours preparing for depositions, reviewing documents with his lawyer, and gathering evidence to support his case. Friends and family offered words of encouragement, reminding him that he was doing the right thing. "You can't let them walk all over you," his brother told him during a phone call. "If you don't stand up for yourself, who will?" As the weeks turned into months, media outlets began picking up the story. Reporters sniffed out the drama, eager to write about the retired rancher taking on a powerful HOA. Headlines popped up everywhere. "Man sues HOA over fishing rights." "Battle over backyard boundaries turns ugly," and "retiree fights back against neighborly harassment." Journalists camped outside the courthouse, hoping to catch a glimpse of John or snap photos of HOA board members arriving for hearings. The attention brought mixed feelings. On one hand, John appreciated the support from strangers who reached out to share their own stories of dealing with difficult HOAs. Many thanked him for having the courage to take a stand, saying his fight gave them hope. On the other hand, the spotlight made him uncomfortable. He didn't want to be seen as some kind of crusader or hero. He just wanted justice. One particularly memorable moment came when a reporter asked him why he was suing for such a large sum. John paused, choosing his words carefully. "It's not about the money," he said firmly. "This is about accountability. They crossed a line, and I'm not going to let them get away with it. If this teaches them or anyone else that you can't treat people this way, then maybe something good will come out of all this mess." Back at the ranch, John found solace in the little things. Early mornings spent feeding the chickens. Afternoons tinkering in the workshop and evenings sitting by the fire pit reminded him of why he bought the place in the first place. The land still held its magic, even if it felt overshadowed by the ongoing battle. Sometimes, late at night, he'd sit by the lake and stare at the stars, imagining a future where the conflict was behind him and peace returned. But deep down, John knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Lawsuits are messy, emotionally draining affairs, and this one promised to be no exception. The HOA wasn't backing down, and neither was he. Both sides were digging in their heels, determined to win. What started as a simple misunderstanding had spiraled into a full-blown war, dividing neighbors and testing loyalties. Still, John refused to give up. Every deposition, every court appearance, and every sleepless night fueled his resolve. He wasn't fighting just for himself anymore. He was fighting for anyone who'd ever been bullied by those in power. Whether he won or lost, he vowed to see it through to the end. Because sometimes, standing your ground isn't just about protecting what's yours, it's about proving that fairness matters, even when the odds are stacked against you. The day of the trial arrived, and the small-town courthouse buzzed with anticipation. Reporters jostled for position outside, microphones in hand, while curious onlookers filled the wooden benches inside the courtroom. The case had become a local sensation, drawing attention not just from nearby residents, but also from people across the state, who saw it as a David versus Goliath battle. For John, walking into that room felt surreal, like stepping onto a stage he never asked to be on. As he took his seat beside his lawyer, John scanned the crowd. Some faces were familiar, neighbors from the gated community, many of whom avoided eye contact or whispered among themselves. Others were strangers, drawn by curiosity or outrage over the story they'd read online. The HOA board members sat together at their table, looking tense and uncomfortable. Their expensive suits and polished shoes couldn't hide the unease etched on their faces. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. After a few formalities, the proceedings began. John's lawyer opened with a powerful statement, painting a clear picture of what had happened. He described how John, a retired man simply trying to enjoy his property, had been harassed, intimidated, and falsely accused by an organization that was supposed to promote harmony, not hostility. "This isn't just about fishing rights," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "It's about justice. It's about holding people accountable when they abuse their power." One by one, witnesses were called to testify. John's side presented irrefutable evidence, satellite images showing the exact boundaries of his property, historical records proving ownership of the lake, and expert testimony from surveyors confirming there was no legal basis for the HOA's claims. A neighbor who lived farther down the road even spoke up, describing how peaceful John had always been since moving in. "He keeps to himself," she said, "never causes trouble. This whole thing seems blown out of proportion." But the HOA didn't go down without a fight. Their lawyers argued that their actions stemmed from genuine concerns about protecting shared resources and maintaining order within the community. They claimed the lake wasn't just a feature of John's property, it was part of the natural landscape everyone benefited from. Witnesses from the gated community testified reluctantly, recounting instances where they believed John might have encroached on their space. One woman recounted seeing him near the fence line late at night, though under cross-examination, she admitted she wasn't entirely sure what he was doing there. Tensions ran high throughout the trial. Arguments erupted between lawyers, objections flew back and forth, and the judge occasionally banged her gavel to restore order. At times, it felt less like a court case and more like a heated town hall meeting. Emotion spilled over, especially during testimony from HOA members. Some broke down in tears, insisting they only wanted to protect their neighborhood. Others grew defensive, accusing John of being overly litigious and vindictive. For John, sitting through it all was exhausting. Each accusation against him felt like another punch to the gut, but he stayed composed, focusing on the facts rather than letting anger take over. During breaks, he stepped outside to clear his head, sipping coffee and reminding himself why he was here. This wasn't just about winning. It was about proving a point that no one should be bullied into submission, no matter how powerful the other side seemed. The most dramatic moment came when John himself took the stand. Dressed in a simple button-down shirt and jeans, he looked every bit the unassuming rancher he was. His lawyer guided him through his testimony, asking him to explain everything from the purchase of the property to the harassment he endured. When he recounted the nights of blaring music and spotlights shining into his windows, his voice cracked slightly. "I just wanted peace," he said, looking directly at the jury. "All I ever wanted was to live quietly on my own land." Under cross-examination, the HOA lawyer tried to paint John as unreasonable and aggressive. "Isn't it true you could have avoided all this by simply talking to the HOA?" the lawyer pressed. John shook his head calmly. "I did talk to them," he replied. "I showed them documents proving the lake is mine. But instead of listening, they doubled down. They made my life miserable. I didn't start this fight, they did." By the end of the trial, both sides had laid out their arguments, leaving the decision in the hands of the jury. Deliberation stretched on for days, each hour feeling like an eternity for John. He spent the time working around the ranch, keeping busy to distract himself from the uncertainty. Every knock on the door made his heart race, wondering if it was news from the courthouse. Finally, the verdict came. The courtroom was packed once again as the judge instructed the jury foreman to read their decision. As the words "in favor of the plaintiff" rang out, John exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The jury awarded him $1.80 million in compensatory damages and $700,000 in punitive damages, totaling the $2.5 million he had originally sought. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by murmurs of disbelief. The judge added a final blow, issuing a permanent injunction barring the HOA from interfering with John's use of his property. It was a sweeping victory, one that left the HOA board members visibly stunned. Some buried their faces in their hands, while others exchanged angry glances. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed John, firing questions about how he felt and what message he hoped to send. "It's bittersweet," John admitted, standing tall despite the fatigue evident in his eyes. "I didn't ask for any of this. All I wanted was to live in peace. But if this teaches people to treat each other fairly and respect boundaries, then maybe something good will come out of it." Back at the ranch, John allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, untouched by the chaos of the past months. He knew the scars wouldn't fade overnight, the distrust between him and the HOA, the stress of the lawsuit, the toll it took on his mental health. But as he cast his fishing line into the water, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things would settle down now. And if they didn't? Well, John had proven he was ready to stand his ground no matter what. The victory in court was sweet, but it didn't magically erase the tension that had built up over months. For John, life on the ranch slowly started to return to normal, though normal now carried a different weight. The scars of the battle lingered, not just in the form of stress or sleepless nights, but in the strained relationship between him and the gated community. Neighbors who once waved casually from their cars now avoided eye contact altogether. Conversations at the local grocery store turned awkward when people recognized him, unsure whether to congratulate him or criticize him. At first, John tried to reach out. He sent a letter to the HOA board, not gloating about his win, but extending an olive branch. "We're neighbors," he wrote. "This feud has gone on long enough. Let's find a way to move forward." but the response was lukewarm at best. A brief email came back thanking him for reaching out, but there was no real effort to rebuild trust. It was clear they weren't ready to let go of their resentment, and neither were many of the residents. Still, John refused to let bitterness consume him. He reminded himself why he bought the ranch in the first place: peace, freedom, and a chance to live life on his own terms. Every morning he woke up early, brewed a pot of coffee, and stepped outside to take in the fresh air. The hills still rolled endlessly, the birds still chirped, and the lake remained as serene as ever. None of that beauty had changed. Only his perspective had shifted slightly. In the weeks following the trial, the fallout within the HOA became impossible to ignore. The board faced intense scrutiny from its own members. Some accused them of mismanaging funds by hiring expensive lawyers instead of settling early. Others criticized their stubbornness, arguing that the lawsuit could have been avoided altogether if they'd simply respected John's property rights. Internal conflicts erupted during meetings, with shouting matches becoming commonplace. Eventually, several board members resigned under pressure, leaving the organization scrambling to regroup. Reforms followed, some genuine, others merely cosmetic. New rules were implemented to prevent similar disputes in the future, including clearer guidelines about property boundaries and stricter oversight of complaints filed against neighbors. While these changes signaled progress, skepticism lingered among both residents and outsiders. Would the HOA truly learn from this experience, or would history repeat itself the next time someone challenged their authority? For John, the aftermath wasn't just about rebuilding his own life, it was about setting an example. People began reaching out to him, sharing stories of their own battles with HOAs or other powerful entities. Many thanked him for standing up, saying his courage inspired them to fight back against unfair treatment. One woman even drove hours to meet him, explaining how her family had been bullied by their HOA for painting their house a non-approved color. She left with tears in her eyes, grateful for the advice and encouragement John offered. Despite the praise, John never saw himself as a hero. "I'm just a guy who wanted to fish in his own lake," he often joked when reporters asked about his newfound fame. Yet deep down, he knew the impact of his actions extended beyond his personal victory. By taking a stand, he'd shown others that fighting for fairness, even against overwhelming odds, was worth it. Life eventually settled into a quieter rhythm. The harassment stopped, the spotlights disappeared, and the noise faded away. John returned to his routines, feeding the chickens, fixing fences, and spending lazy afternoons by the lake. Fishing became therapeutic again, a way to reconnect with nature and quiet his mind. On especially peaceful evenings, he'd sit by the water's edge, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting fiery hues across the sky. In those moments, he felt grounded, reminding himself what truly mattered. But the story didn't end with John alone on his ranch. The case sparked broader conversations about property rights, neighborly respect, and the role of HOAs in modern communities. Local newspapers published editorials debating whether such organizations wielded too much power. Legal experts weighed in, discussing the importance of accountability and transparency. Even national media picked up on the narrative, framing it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority. For the gated community, the lesson hit close to home. Some residents admitted privately that they regretted jumping on the bandwagon against John without fully understanding the facts. Others grew more cautious about blindly supporting the HOA's decisions, questioning motives and demanding evidence before backing accusations. Slowly, cracks began to form in the wall of hostility that had divided the two sides. One day, months after the trial, something unexpected happened. A young couple from the gated community knocked on John's door, holding a basket filled with homemade cookies. They introduced themselves nervously, explaining they'd recently moved in and wanted to apologize for how things had unfolded. "We weren't part of all that mess," the husband said, shifting uncomfortably. "But we know it wasn't right, and we wanted to say sorry." John smiled, genuinely touched by their gesture. "Thank you," he replied warmly, accepting the basket. "Apologies mean a lot, and I appreciate your kindness." It was a small step toward healing, but it gave him hope that bridges could be rebuilt over time. Looking back on everything, John realized the experience had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He was tougher now, more resilient, and less likely to back down when he believed he was right. But he was also softer in some ways, more empathetic toward others facing injustice, more willing to listen and offer support. The ranch, once a symbol of escape, had become a testament to perseverance and integrity. As seasons passed, the scars of the conflict faded further, replaced by the steady rhythm of rural life. The lake continued to provide solace, its waters reflecting the changing colors of spring blossoms, summer sunsets, and autumn leaves. John fished often, finding joy in the simplicity of casting a line and waiting patiently for a bite. Each tug on his rod reminded him of the balance he'd fought so hard to restore, not just in his life, but in his heart. And while the road ahead might still hold challenges, John faced them with renewed strength. He had proven that standing up for what's right wasn't just about winning, it was about creating change, fostering understanding, and protecting the things that mattered most. In the end, the man who sued for $2.5 million didn't just reclaim his lake. He reclaimed his peace, his dignity, and his faith in the power of justice.